did a book it took me about 5 years, and it had to do with U.S. government recruitment of Nazis and Nazi collaborators in the wake of World War II. And in the course of doing this book, it involved a large number of Freedom of Information Act requests and quite a bit of archival research and that type of thing. And the book ended up winning a couple of prizes.
Let's see the book.
Sure. Buy this book, now available in paperback. If it's not in your store, ask why it isn't.
And so what's the title mean?
The title is Blowback, and that's spy jargon for a covert operation that begins successfully overseas, but it goes wrong, and it blows back in your face with unexpected and negative results.
Okay.
Well, the media, how can I start this? Well, I'll tell you one thing that would be good, just as far as this interview is concerned, is to have, kind of like more back and forth, Q&A. I mean, it would be easier for me to deal with that. But part of the difficulty in dealing with these kind of issues is that television, the framework or the format of television, is not particularly good for handling complex stories, and particularly when stories deal with a lot of documentation or a lot of documentary research. If you think about television, and you think about what you see on television, you'll find that TV is really good at car chases, it's good at gunfights, it's good at conveying emotional stories, but it's not particularly good at evidence or presenting intricate arguments. One thing, I mean, take for example, if you had a discussion between Albert Einstein and Mo Howard of the Three Stooges as far as nuclear physics. Okay, well, you got Albert Einstein over here, and you get Mo Howard over there. And you give Mo a few lessons from a Madison Avenue advertising firm about how to appear on television, how to articulate ideas. And bango, Mo Howard is going to be as credible on television as Albert Einstein is. This creates problems in having intelligence discussions of particularly the underside of society, or the hidden aspects of the way the government works. So one thing that I do in this book is use the archival record, the U.S. National Archives and stuff from obtained through Freedom of Information Act, to try to get at the hidden history of American intelligence agencies in the wake of the war, wake of World War II. And the particular example that I'm looking at are the use of Nazis, particularly Nazis as intelligence agents. And one reason for looking at Nazis is that it's an important question on its face, what became of these people. But another aspect of it is that the moral issues are rather clearly drawn. You talk about the Iran-Contra affair or something like this, and you can always have a Oliver North type or John Poindexter or someone who comes on and says that the Nicaraguan Contras are noble freedom fighters and so on. But when you're talking about Nazis, the moral issues tend to be rather clearly drawn. And one thing that I found during the research was that even people who were the personal staff of Adolf Eichmann, who were the central administrative apparatus of the mass extermination programs, even people like that were considered suitable for recruitment as intelligence agents.
Why?
Well, the rationale or the official explanation is that they had something special to offer, that their contribution would somehow protect the United States. So then what one has to do is to examine that rationale. Is it true or is it false? What did these people actually do when they were on the payroll? And what you find is not a heck of a lot. The documentary record for a number of these senior Nazis is very clear today. You can go back and inspect it for yourself. What you find is, for example, we protected Klaus Barbie, who was the Gestapo chief of Lyon, France. Lyon's a big town, you know, it's like Pittsburgh or something like that. It's a big industrial town. This guy was chief of secret police. Here's a man who made his mark during the war by deporting orphan children to death camps. That's what he did for a living. And the decision was made by Army intelligence to protect him after the war because supposedly he could make this contribution. And what was the contribution? Well, you go out and you look at his file today, you find he would collect leaflets that communists handed out on street corners in small towns in Germany. He had his boys go out, and there was a collection of gossip and rumors and information, intelligence, quote unquote, about the French and the Romanians and so on.
So these guys were there because they were anti-communist?
Yeah. Basically, there was a Cold War mentality the phrase, you know, I interviewed a ranking CIA officer who was in charge of some of these programs, and his phrase was, any bastard as long as he's anti-communist.
And how important were these people in defending American interests?
In defending American interests, I would say not particularly important, but they had unforeseen consequences. This is an example of the United States shooting itself in the foot through particularly covert operations. And I think that that's one reason why the business with the Nazis after World War II is relevant to the situation in the 1990s. And I'll give you one example of this. In 1945, the chief of German military intelligence on the Eastern Front, that's the war in those days was between the Germans and the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe, was a man by the name of Reinhard Gehlen. And Gehlen had taken part in a program that the Germans ran during the war, in which they herded Soviet prisoners of war into prison camps and then systematically starved them to death. They murdered somewhere between 3 and 4 million people in this way. And the ones who got out of these starvation camps were ones that would cooperate with General Gehlen, would give him some information. So after the war, the Soviet Union wanted General Gehlen very badly. They wanted to put him on trial for war crimes. Now, Gehlen surrendered to the Americans in the spring of 1945. And eventually he came to the attention of the man who was in charge of Army intelligence in Europe, and he was brought to the United States, given a debriefing, and set up in a special spy center, really, in West Germany, where he ran operations after World War II, and eventually became chief of the West German Intelligence Service. All right. Now, the point here is not what one thinks of Gehlen. The point here is that when we hired Gehlen, there was a price tag connected to him in terms of our relationship with the Soviets. And it seemed at the time that nobody in the United States government understood that this price tag was connected to Gehlen. The idea was we could simply put him on the payroll, exploit his intelligence. This was very clever, and that would be the end of it. But the Soviets knew that Gehlen was on the payroll. And the Soviets knew that here was a guy who had been involved in extraordinarily brutal activities against the Soviets, who was committed to overthrowing the Soviet government, and so on. So how did the Soviets read this recruitment and protection of General Gehlen? Well, their interpretation was that, or at least this is evident from their statements, that by recruiting General Gehlen, we were embarking upon a clandestine war against the USSR. Mm-hmm. And that the only way for them to respond to this was to embark on a clandestine war of their own. Now, I'm not defending Joseph Stalin. And I'm not saying what the Soviet Union did during the Cold War was right. What I am saying is that we have to be grown-ups about how we deal with our government policy abroad. And we have to understand that if we're going to pick up a secret police chief from a given country, that the opponents of that secret police chief are going to read that gesture and interpret that in a certain way.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay. I mean, the Soviets had lost 20 million in World War II, and they were slightly resentful against the Nazis,
To say the least.
So they were paranoid to begin with, and the United States, it seems, gave them a good rationale to be paranoid.
That's right.
Do you think there's any significance now that this whole generation of Nazis are dying off, that the Cold War is starting to sort of relax?
Well, I would argue that the motion towards a détente, if you will, or a relaxation of tensions between the U.S. and the Soviets is not driven by the death of old Nazis. It's driven by particularly actions, rather dramatic actions, on the Soviet side that demonstrate that they very much want a relaxation of tensions. And on the American side, they're slowly, painfully, but nonetheless there's motion, that also on the American side there seems to be a desire to relax tensions. And I think it's been very beneficial for everybody concerned, including the Europeans. I would argue that some of this relaxation of tensions could have come about not in 1989, after spending $3 trillion or whatever the heck it is we spent over the last 40 years on armaments, but rather in the 1940s. If the two sides in the mid-1940s, 45, 46, 47, had been willing to take substantial steps in order to diffuse tension between the superpowers, I think that a lot of this conflict could have been avoided. Now, wait a minute. Now we come back to the whole television, the whole business with television. It's because people are going to believe that or not believe that, agree with me, disagree with me, on the basis of their kind of gut response to that. It's really quite impossible to make a complicated argument, to really examine evidence in the television medium. The reason for this is that there's so little time, that everything is done with pictures and with the spoken word, and that's not a particularly efficient way to transmit complicated ideas. So what happens is that when television looks or attempts to look at intelligence activities, it necessarily comes up with a distorted image. And this isn't because the TV people aren't professionals. They are professionals, and usually highly professional. The limitation is in the medium itself. So what happens is that because so many of us are dependent upon TV to try to understand things like the Iran-Contra affair, or the business with General Noriega and so on, it's very easy for the government to sweep those types of activities under the rug. Now, we're sitting here in Washington. It's midwinter 1989, 1990. And by and large, the Iran-Contra business has all kind of gone away. It's dissipated. You don't see it in the media anymore. But the fact of the matter is looking back on it, there's credible evidence that, number one, George Bush lied to the American people throughout the campaign process about what he had done during the Iran-Contra business. That, we'll say Oliver North, for example, who comes across on television as a man of bravery and integrity, if you look at the actual record of events, one finds a man who is not particularly brave, not particularly honest, and not particularly smart. But the myth of Oliver North and the myth of George Bush's version of Iran-Contra seems to be much more powerful than the actual facts of what took place. Scientists.
What do you have to say about social science, being a social scientist yourself?
Well, I've been doing some research that has to do with the roots of American mass communication research, and also the interrelationship between mass communication research and American psychological warfare after World War II. And what turns up is that a number of sort of the founding fathers of mass communication research were on the government's payroll for 20 years and undertook projects that they could market to the government and also to private clients. And one of the effects that this had, I think, is that it distorted the field of mass communications research. In other words, we know quite a bit about the effect or non-effects of television on its viewers. There's, whole encyclopedias of statistical reports about this type of television has that type of effect, and questionnaires and back and forth. But still in all, we know relatively little about the communications process, and particularly we don't know very much about communications for any purpose other than manipulating people. The whole thrust of the field in those years was, what is the best way to manipulate an audience? What are the magic keys by which we could use through television, through radio, through distribution of leaflets, whatever it is, that the government could use to get them to do what they wanted, both as far as American citizens are concerned and as far as foreign audiences are concerned. And one must admit that persuading people to do things is certainly part of what communication is about. But it's not the whole thing. There's another aspect of communication that is more basic and in a certain sense more humane, which has to do with sharing and communion. It's the root word is the same root. So what does this mean? Okay, so getting back to the theme about intelligence that we've been discussing here. During the 1950s, we know, and we can document today, the government undertook very large-scale propaganda campaigns aimed at shaping American public opinion as to what we were supposed to think about foreign affairs, how we were supposed to look at the German question, how we were supposed to look at what was going on in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union and so on. And the particular vehicle through which this was done had to do with the National Committee for a Free Europe and a number of its allied organizations. Now, the story here is this, is that immediately after World War II, the U.S. wanted to maintain diplomatic relations with countries like Hungary and Poland and Romania and so on. At the same time, because those countries had been overrun by the Red Army during the war, there was a strong trend in the U.S. government towards overthrowing the very same governments. And in fact, it was part of our policy to try to instigate revolutions in Eastern Europe and, if possible, inside the Soviet Union itself. Now, some of the people that we were using in order to pursue this policy were extreme right-wing political groups that had been on the payroll of Berlin during World War II. You remember the Nazis invaded these countries during the course of the war, particularly the Soviet Union I'm referring to now, and they would set up puppet governments in the areas under German control. Well, the same people who had run those puppet governments, and who, by the way, had also run the mass extermination programs during the Nazi occupation, they retreated back to West Germany at the end of the war. Well, so the brainstorm in American psychological warfare operations after World War II is that we would put these same people on the payroll as propagandists and covert operators and different sorts of agents, and instigate revolutions inside the communist countries in Eastern Europe. So that was one half of the psychological warfare campaign of those days. The other side of this was that these kind of programs were rather expensive. At the same time, there was also a very large military escalation going on in the United States, which was extremely expensive. We were paying more spending more on our military in 48 and 49, at a time when we were ostensibly at peace, 49 certainly, than we had during the height of World War II. So it became necessary to try to convince the American people that we had to do this, and we had to pay these taxes, that we had to have the military forces abroad, and so on. And one way that was done was through the CIA. The CIA created this National Committee for a Free Europe. It was two people mainly were responsible for putting this together. It's George Kennan, who was then at the State Department, and Allen Dulles, who was then in private practice as a lawyer, but who later would become director of the CIA. And they put together these Free Europe committees that the emigre groups that I was discussing a moment ago, they would put these emigre groups on the payroll, so that that was the channel through which money was passed to these organizations, some of which had collaborated with the Nazis during the war, for use as psychological warfare operators. Well, to bring it back to the United States, most people who were, I don't know, 30, from their mid-30s or older, will remember the Radio Free Europe promotions on television. The Let Freedom Ring promotions, and send in your nickels and dimes to support Radio Free Europe. And the fact of the matter is, Radio Free Europe's bills are being paid by the CIA, and a sister project, which was known as it started out as Radio Liberation from Bolshevism, but is now today known as Radio Liberty. The bills of those organizations were actually being paid by the Central Intelligence Agency. The agency, in what, at least in my opinion, is a violation of the law, secretly underwrote the activities of a group called Crusade for Freedom, that was the main propaganda arm of these psychological warfare operations in the United States. And the Crusade for Freedom got about $5 million to start out with, to produce commercials. They produce radio commercials, TV, newspaper, magazine promotions, and so on. And the various private media outlets were given tax deductions in order to publish these advertisements and these promotions. Well, the point of these promotions, and you can read this in the group's own literature, was to convince the American people to support the U.S. government's strategy in Eastern Europe. Now, whether or not one agrees with that strategy, it is evident that the U.S. government has no business propagandizing in this fashion to the American people. They work for us, not the other way around. And more than that, they realized that at the time that this was probably illegal. So to what, how big was this program? Well, its initial budget was $5 million, and you can go back and you can look at what did $5 million buy in terms of media time during the early 1950s. Well, the amount of money that the CIA spent trying to convince the American people to follow the CIA strategy in Europe was more money than the combined total of all the money that was spent on the Dewey-Truman election campaign of 1948. The CIA was the largest political advertiser in the United States during the early 1950s. And only the commercial giants like General Motors and Procter & Gamble and so on were spending more money trying to sell ideas to the American people. So part of and this program was simply a component of a much more complex group of programs designed to manipulate people through the media. The agency had its own guys in certain newspapers. It had the capability of planting stories in different media. It had quite a number of scholars on its payroll, and so on. And the director of these programs is a man by the name of Frank Wisner. He used to refer to his mighty Wurlitzer. Wurlitzer is an old type of organ that could make all different sorts of sounds, and he would talk about how through manipulation of the press he could make the newspaper scream, or make them purr, or make them do what he wanted. And part of the effect of this is that the government, and particularly the agency, was able to set the parameters of what were legitimate ideas and what were not legitimate ideas, particularly as far as foreign affairs are concerned. They were able to say, in effect, that it was okay to think maybe this far, but no farther than that. And that ability, we see that ability still today when we're looking at the situation in Latin America, when we're looking at the situation in Eastern Europe, is that because of its money, because of its credibility, because of its ability to advance a scholar's career or to block a person's career, the government intelligence agencies can shape what we think and what we see on the media about, particularly about foreign affairs questions. I think that that's very dangerous, because we're a very powerful country. We have enormous influence and impact on other people's lives. And for the most part, we are quite ignorant about what our impact on their lives is. And when you have the government with rather substantial influence on telling us what our impact on these people's lives is, one gets a sort of institutionalized ignorance about American role in foreign affairs that I think is part of what explains why we seem to why our strategy overseas seems to keep blowing up in our face. Where does this blowback phenomena come from? Say in Panama, for example. Part of the explanation for this is that the information that we're told about what's going on, particularly in third world countries, is often shaped by people who have a rather large interest in selling one policy or another policy. That's enough for now.
Let me ask you one more question.
Sure.
In your study of the documents, in your study of these policies, who's in control? Who's on who's making these decisions? Where are they coming from? If it's not a democratic process, and who's really ruling America?
Well, it's a very complicated question. The main shape of policy initiatives clearly comes from the White House on down. It cannot be said that, for example, the presidents in both Democratic presidents and Republican presidents, that the presidents didn't know what was going on. The main policy documents were passed by the National Security Council, which is the most senior national security policy organization in the country, and they were either directly signed by the president or directly reviewed by the president. So the presidents had a good idea of the main thrust of what was going on. So in that sense, the president is culpable. But what one finds is that we get the motion of social machinery that is considerably larger and less predictable than simply the idea of some kind of a plot in which the president or Allen Dulles or somebody else was pulling strings. The fact is that when you have say, take the coup d'etat in Guatemala that took place in the mid-1950s, many different factions of power had their fingers into that one. You had the president on the one hand, you had the CIA, you had certain elements of corporate America, the United Fruit Company in that particular case, but there's been other cases. And these groups interact with each other. Their interests overlap. And to a certain degree, one can even see that forces are spinning outside of these persons' control. On the one hand, they want to take the Guatemala example. They wanted to overthrow the Guatemalan government basically because the Guatemalan government was raising questions about the legitimacy of Banana Republic rule by the United Fruit Company. So they wanted the government there out. On the other hand, the broader system by which our country, the United States, influences life abroad and has impact on people's lives is not always understood or in control of corporate America, for example. I mean, I don't think that the president of AT&T and IBM and so on sits down and kind of rubs their hands and says, well, how many children can we starve today in Guatemala? That's not the way it works. But as a practical matter, the system of international relations, which largely benefits the AT&Ts and the IBMs of the world, leads in lockstep to starvation of children in Guatemala. The Pope John Paul recently had an encyclical on this. I'm not a big fan of Pope John Paul, but the encyclical was a very sensible document, and it said quite explicitly that we're in a international situation today where some of these social machines, like corporations, like governments, seem to run practically by themselves to benefit the people in the most developed countries, that means us, at the expense of the large majority of humanity. And there's a couple of problems with this. One is a moral problem that the Pope points to, but even if we, if one's to be cynical about all this and say, well, too bad what's going on in Brazil or South Korea or North Korea for that matter, there's a strictly practical problem, and that is that we've created this situation where so much of the world is so deeply in debt to the particularly American companies, also European companies, that they spend all of their time just paying the interest on these loans. It's like being overextended on your credit card. And part of the problem with this is that it creates a situation where the people in Brazil or Mexico, wherever, are locked into poverty. And even if one doesn't care about the suffering that this creates, the one thing that this does create is that there's nobody to buy the American products. If a person is an auto worker, if a person is a farmer, if a person is it doesn't matter if you make telephones. Somebody has got to buy this stuff, And if we create a international system in which the most people are systematically impoverished, then there is the system breaks down under its own weight.